April 18th, 1943. A clear morning over the Solomon Islands. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers are flying low above the jungle canopy of southern Bougainville, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. In the lead aircraft sits Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the most important military figure in Japan, the man who planned Pearl Harbor. He is wearing a green field uniform rather than the customary dress white. He is on an inspection tour of forward air bases. His itinerary was transmitted 4 days ago in a coded radio message from his headquarters at Rabaul, encrypted in the Japanese Navy's operational cipher, a system the Imperial Navy considers mathematically unbreakable. At 9:34 local time, 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters of the 339th Fighter Squadron appear out of the west, flying at treetop height to avoid Japanese radar. They have been in the air for more than 2 hours. They have navigated over 400 miles of open ocean by dead reckoning alone, without radio communication, maintaining absolute silence, on a course plotted by their flight leader, Major John Mitchell, with nothing but a compass and a watch. They know exactly where the 2 bombers will be. They know exactly when the bombers will arrive. They know the altitude. They know the heading. They know the number of escorts. They have known all of this for 4 days, ever since American signals intelligence intercepted and decrypted a Japanese naval message detailing the Admiral's itinerary down to the minute. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber peel off from the formation and climb toward the bombers. Within 90 seconds, the lead G-4M, carrying Yamamoto, is burning. It crashes into the jungle north of Bougainville. There are no survivors. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, riding in the second bomber, watches his commander's aircraft spiral downward, trailing smoke and fire. His own plane is hit. It crashes into the sea off the coast of Bougainville. Ugaki survives. He is pulled from the water badly injured, one of only 3 survivors from the 2 bombers. He will spend weeks recovering. The question of who shot down which bomber will be disputed for decades, with both Lanphier and Barber claiming the kill. The weight of the evidence points to Barber, whose P-38 returned with 104 bullet holes. But the question of credit is not the question that matters. The question that matters is how the Americans knew. When the news reaches the Japanese Navy's senior staff, it triggers an investigation that will consume weeks and produce a conclusion that is, in retrospect, one of the most revealing intelligence failures of the entire war. The investigators want to know one thing: how did the Americans know? How did 16 fighters appear at the precise coordinates, at the precise minute, to intercept 2 specific aircraft on a schedule that had been communicated only through encrypted channels? Someone, the investigators reason, must have betrayed the itinerary. A spy, a leak, a captured document. They examine the possibility that their operational cipher has been compromised. They reject it. The cipher, they conclude, is secure. The staff officer who originally transmitted Yamamoto's itinerary had even expressed concern about communications security before the message was sent. But his concern was about the Army's codes, not the Navy's. The investigation settles on a different explanation. They blame a low-grade Army code. They blame local security failures. They blame anything and everything except the one thing that was actually true. The Americans had read the message. They had broken the cipher. They had been reading it for more than a year. And they would go on reading it for the rest of the war, because the Imperial Japanese Navy, having concluded that its codes were unbreakable, never took the steps necessary to make them so. To protect the secret, the Americans circulated a cover story crediting Australian coast watchers with spotting the aircraft. Japan did not publicly announce Yamamoto's death until May 21st. More than a month later, the cover held. The question that the Japanese investigation could not answer in April of 1943 is the question this entire story turns on. Not just how the Americans broke one code on one occasion, but how the United States, a country Japan's military leadership regarded as culturally incapable of mastering the Japanese language, built 3 separate systems for penetrating Japanese military communications, each one exploiting a different dimension of Japan's own assumptions, and how all 3 systems worked because of something the Japanese officer corps never anticipated and never understood even after the war was over. To see why Japanese officers could not grasp what was happening to their most secret orders, we need to go back, not to Pearl Harbor, not to the first American code-breaking efforts, but to a much older story. We need to go back to the nature of the Japanese language itself, and to a national assumption about that language which had been building for centuries, an assumption that would quietly become the single greatest vulnerability in Japan's entire war effort. The Japanese writing system is, by any objective measure, one of the most complex communication systems ever devised by a human civilization. It uses 3 interlocking scripts. Kanji, the logographic characters borrowed from Chinese, number in the tens of thousands. A literate adult is expected to know at least 2,000. Each character can have multiple readings depending on context. Layered on top of the kanji are 2 phonetic syllabaries, hiragana and katakana, each containing 46 basic characters. Military Japanese added another layer of difficulty. Orders, intelligence summaries, and operational plans were often written in a formal literary style, rooted in classical Japanese. A register as different from spoken Japanese as medieval Latin is from modern Italian. Technical military vocabulary drew on obscure kanji compounds that even educated Japanese civilians would struggle to parse. For centuries, this complexity had been a source of quiet national pride. The Japanese language was not merely a tool for communication. It was understood, within Japan's intellectual tradition, as an expression of Japanese uniqueness itself. When Japan opened to the outside world after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, it adopted Western technology, Western military organization, Western industrial methods, and Western constitutional structures. It did not adopt a Western language. The decision was deliberate. Japan would modernize everything except the thing that made it Japanese. The language remained the innermost wall of the fortress, and it was the one wall the reformers never considered dismantling. By the early 20th century, this pride had hardened into an operational assumption. The idea that a foreigner, particularly a Westerner, could truly master Japanese, not tourist Japanese, but the dense, elusive, character-heavy Japanese of government and military communication, was treated not as unlikely, but as something closer to impossible. Western diplomats in Tokyo were known to struggle with basic correspondence. Western scholars who devoted careers to the language were respected precisely because the effort was considered so extraordinary. The assumption was so deep that it did not feel like an assumption at all. It felt like a fact of nature. The language was a wall. It did not need to be defended because it could not be breached. When the Imperial Japanese Navy designed its operational cipher systems in the 1930s, this assumption was built into the architecture. The Navy's primary operational code, which American codebreakers would designate JN-25, was a super-enciphered system. Each word or phrase was assigned a 5-digit number from a codebook. Those numbers were then further disguised by adding a second set of 5-digit numbers from an additive table. To read a message, you needed both the codebook and the correct additive table, and even then, the underlying text was in Japanese, a language the code designers were confident no American could read with the speed or precision required for military intelligence. The Foreign Ministry operated a separate system. Its most sensitive diplomatic traffic was encrypted by a machine the Japanese called the Type B cipher machine, a device that used telephone stepping switches rather than the rotor mechanisms employed by the German Enigma. American codebreakers would give it the code name Purple. The Japanese diplomats who used it believed it was unbreakable. Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima, Japan's envoy in Berlin, whose cables to Tokyo contained some of the most strategically valuable intelligence of the entire war, was once warned by the Germans that his cipher might be compromised. He dismissed the concern. His messages, he said, were double encrypted. He would go to his grave in 1975, never knowing that the Americans had been reading his dispatches since September of 1940. The irony is extraordinary. Oshima was Hitler's most trusted foreign confidant. He toured the Atlantic Wall fortifications in France before D-Day. He reported on German troop dispositions, weapons programs, and strategic intentions in detailed cables that went straight to Tokyo, encrypted in purple. Every one of those cables was intercepted and decrypted by the Americans. General George Marshall assessed during the war that the main basis of American information regarding Hitler's intentions in Europe was obtained from Oshima's messages from Berlin. A Japanese ambassador, using a Japanese cipher that Japan believed was unbreakable, had become one of the Allies' most valuable intelligence sources on Nazi Germany without knowing it. This was Japan's linguistic fortress, multiple layers of mathematical encryption, built on a foundation of a language that the designers assumed no enemy could penetrate. And in the early months of the war, the fortress appeared to hold. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American intelligence had, in fact, already broken the purple diplomatic cipher. A team, led by William Friedman, the Army's chief cryptanalyst, had achieved the breakthrough on September 20, 1940, when a young analyst named Genevieve Grotjan spotted the cyclical patterns in the stepping switches. The intelligence derived from purple, codenamed Magic, had been providing Washington with a window into Japanese diplomatic intentions for over a year before the attack. The cost of that breakthrough was severe. Friedman, who had been working on the problem for 18 months, with a small team that included Frank Rowlett, had pushed himself beyond endurance. The mental strain of holding thousands of mathematical relationships in his head simultaneously, of testing and discarding hypothesis after hypothesis, of knowing that the work was critical and that failure could mean national catastrophe, broke him. In early 1941, Friedman was hospitalized with a nervous breakdown. He would recover and return to work, but the episode revealed something about the nature of what the Americans were doing. They were not breaking Japanese codes with machines alone. They were breaking them with human minds that were being pushed to their absolute limits, and some of those minds cracked under the pressure. A Navy engineer named Leo Rosen built a working analog of the purple machine without ever having seen the original, reverse engineering its architecture entirely from the patterns in the intercepted messages. It was one of the great feats of applied cryptanalysis in history, and it remained classified for decades. But magic could not prevent Pearl Harbor. The system for distributing the intercepted messages was slow, compartmentalized, and bureaucratically tangled. The famous 14-part message breaking off negotiations was decoded and translated in Washington, but the warning did not reach Hawaii in time. The result was catastrophe. 2,400 Americans dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled, and an intelligence community that possessed one of the greatest code-breaking achievements in history and had been unable to use it when it mattered most. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, as Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific with a speed that stunned the world, American signals intelligence was in disarray. Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit in Hawaii, was working around the clock in a windowless basement at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, trying to break enough of JN-25 to provide actionable intelligence. The unit's commander was a man named Joseph Rochefort, a 41-year-old naval officer who had spent 3 years in Japan from 1929 to 1932, and who spoke the language fluently, one of a handful of American naval officers who did. Rochefort was an unusual figure in the wartime Navy. He was brilliant, difficult, and almost pathologically indifferent to his own comfort. He worked in slippers and a bathrobe because he rarely left the basement. He slept on a cot beside his desk. He drank coffee until it stopped working, and then drank more. His team of linguists, mathematicians, and radio traffic analysts were processing thousands of intercepted messages, most of which they could only partially read. The work was agonizing. Each intercept was a puzzle with missing pieces, and the pieces that existed were in a language and a code that resisted every shortcut. By the spring of 1942, Hypo could decipher fragments. Not whole messages, fragments. enough to see shapes in the fog, and one shape kept reappearing. A major Japanese naval operation was being planned. The target was designated in the Japanese messages by a two-letter geographic code, AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, the tiny island group northwest of Hawaii. His counterparts at the Navy's code-breaking headquarters in Washington, a rival unit designated OP-20G, disagreed. They believed the target was somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly the Aleutian Islands. The argument went to the highest levels of the Navy. To settle it, one of Rochefort's officers, Jasper Holmes, devised a ruse. He had the garrison at Midway transmit an uncoded message, in plain language over an open channel, reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that the garrison was running short of water. It was a lie. The water plant was fine. But if the Japanese intercepted the message, and if AF was indeed their designation for Midway, then a Japanese message would soon appear referencing AF and water. On May 22, 1942, Hypo intercepted exactly that message. AF was short of water. Rochefort had his confirmation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, trusting Rochefort's analysis over Washington's objections, positioned 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the patched-together Yorktown, northeast of Midway and waited. On June 4th, when the Japanese strike force, 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, arrived expecting to find an undefended island, they found instead an ambush. American dive bombers struck while the 3 carriers' hangar decks were crowded with aircraft in the middle of being rearmed and refueled. Ordnance and aviation fuel concentrated in enclosed spaces below. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were burning within minutes of each other. The 4th carrier, the Hairu, launched a retaliatory strike that crippled the Yorktown, but by the end of the day the Hairu was burning too. By the next morning, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk. The Americans lost the Yorktown. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. It was won, in the most direct sense, because a man in slippers in a basement in Hawaii had read enough of the enemy's mail to know where the enemy was going before the enemy got there. But the codebreakers at Hypo and Washington were only one of the 3 systems the United States was building to penetrate Japan's secrets. The second system was something the Japanese could not have imagined in their most elaborate contingency planning. It was not a machine. It was not a mathematical breakthrough. It was a group of young men, most of them in their 20s, who could read Japanese military orders as fluently as the officers who had written them because they were, by ancestry and by upbringing, Japanese themselves. On November 1st, 1941, 5 weeks before Pearl Harbor, a small language school opened in a converted airplane hangar at Crissy Field, inside the Presidio of San Francisco. It had a budget of $2,000. Its first class consisted of 60 students. 58 of them were Nisei, American citizens of Japanese ancestry, born in the United States but in many cases educated partly in Japan. The other 2 were Caucasian. The school's academic director was a man named John Fujio Iso, a Burbank-born graduate of Brown University, where he had been class valedictorian, and Harvard Law School. When Iso had been drafted in 1940, the Army had assigned him to a motor pool. He was washing trucks when an officer named Captain Kai Rasmussen recognized his abilities and pulled him into the language program. Iso would become the highest-ranking Japanese American in the United States Army during the war. He would later become the first Japanese American judge in the contiguous United States. But in November of 1941, he was standing in a drafty hangar, teaching military Japanese to a class of young men whose lives were about to be split in 2 by a contradiction so severe that it still defies easy explanation. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the west coast of the United States. Approximately 110,000 people, roughly 2/3 of them American citizens, were uprooted from their homes and transported to internment camps in remote areas of the interior. Their property was confiscated or sold at a fraction of its value. Their constitutional rights were suspended. They were imprisoned not for anything they had done, but for who they were. And at the same time, in the same country, under the same government, the United States Army was recruiting Nisei, some of them directly from those same internment camps, to serve as its most critical intelligence asset in the Pacific War. The contradiction was not abstract, it was concrete and personal. Some students at the language school in San Francisco slipped out in the spring of 1942 to visit their parents at a nearby racetrack that had been converted into a temporary assembly center, a holding pen where Japanese-American families waited behind barbed wire to be shipped to permanent camps in the desert. The students went back to class the next morning to study Japanese military terminology so they could fight for the country that was doing this to their families. The language school at the Presidio, forced to relocate because Japanese Americans were no longer permitted on the West Coast, moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota, in June of 1942. The choice of Minnesota was not accidental. It was one of the few states that would accept a military installation full of Japanese Americans. The school was renamed the Military Intelligence Service Language School. Its students, who were volunteering to fight for a country that had locked up their families, studied 10 hours a day. Some continued studying in the latrines after lights out because the barracks had no other lighted space after curfew. The curriculum was a crash course in military Japanese, the very language the Imperial Japanese Navy was confident no American could master. The instructors, men like Akira Oshida, Shigeya Kihara, and Arthur Kaneko, drilled the students in the specific registers of Japanese military communication, the formal written style of operational orders, the abbreviated shorthand of field intelligence reports, the technical vocabulary of naval communications. By the end of the war, the school, which moved again to Fort Snelling, Minnesota, in August of 1944 to accommodate its growing enrollment, had graduated more than 6,000 linguists. At its peak, in early 1946, the school had 160 instructors and 3,000 students occupying more than 125 classrooms. Those linguists were deployed to 130 units across the Pacific and Asian theaters. They interrogated prisoners, they translated captured documents, they monitored radio communications. They read Japanese battlefield orders, sometimes within minutes of their interception, and relayed the contents to American commanders who used the intelligence to reposition forces, redirect airstrikes, and anticipate Japanese counterattacks before they began. The scale of what they accomplished is difficult to overstate. By the war's end, the Nisei linguists had translated approximately 20.5 million pages of captured Japanese documents, processed roughly 18,000 individual enemy records, and interrogated more than 10,000 prisoners of war. They were, in effect, an entire intelligence apparatus built from the sons and daughters of the country they were fighting. The prisoners talked, and they talked for a reason the Japanese command had never anticipated. The Japanese military had never trained its soldiers in conduct as prisoners of war because surrender was considered unthinkable. The Field Service Code, the Senjin-kun, issued in January of 1941, stated explicitly that a soldier must not suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. There was no protocol for resisting interrogation because there was no expectation that a Japanese soldier would ever be interrogated. The entire edifice of military discipline was built on the assumption that capture would never happen, and so, when it happened, the captured soldier had no framework for it. His identity as a soldier was gone. His honor, by the standards he had been taught, was gone. He was, in the terms his own culture had given him, already dead. When these men encountered young Americans who spoke to them not in broken textbook phrases, but in fluent, colloquial, regionally inflected Japanese, the effect was psychologically devastating. The Nisei interrogators understood this. They used it. They did not threaten. They did not coerce. They offered cigarettes, food, and conversation in the prisoner's own language, with the grammar and intonation of home. Many prisoners, stripped of the structure that had defined their identity as soldiers, cooperated fully. Some cooperated eagerly, as if the act of speaking to someone who understood them was itself a kind of relief from the impossible position they were in. Japanese military planners, who had built an entire doctrine around the assumption that their men would die rather than talk, had created instead a population of prisoners who had never been taught what to do when dying was no longer an option. There is a story that captures what the Nisei linguists were doing at its most extraordinary. His name was Roy Matsumoto. Before the war, he had been living in the Los Angeles area. After Executive Order 9066, his family was sent to the Jerome internment camp in Arkansas. Matsumoto volunteered for the Army. He was assigned to the 5307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders, the long-range penetration force operating behind Japanese lines in the jungles of Burma. He was one of 14 Nisei linguists attached to the unit. In March of 1944, near the Burmese town of Wallabum, Matsumoto crawled out of the American perimeter alone, in darkness, and tapped a Japanese field telephone line. Lying in the undergrowth within earshot of Japanese soldiers, he listened to their communications and identified the location of a supply dump. He reported the coordinates. American aircraft destroyed it. Weeks later, at a hilltop position the marauders called Nakhpumga, which the men themselves renamed Maggot Hill for the condition of the dead, the 2nd Battalion was surrounded by a Japanese force that outnumbered them significantly. Every night, Matsumoto crawled beyond the perimeter and eavesdropped on Japanese officers planning the next day's assault. He learned the axis of attack, the timing, and the unit assignments. He reported everything. On Easter Sunday, April 1944, Matsumoto learned that a major Japanese assault was coming at dawn. The marauders set an ambush, rigging abandoned foxholes with grenades. When the Japanese force attacked and was momentarily stalled by the initial fire, Matsumoto stood up in full view and shouted a single word in Japanese: "Charge." The Japanese soldiers, hearing the command in their own language from what they assumed was their own officer, surged forward into the killing zone. Dozens of Japanese soldiers died in the killing zone. The attack broke. Matsumoto received the Legion of Merit and the Bronze Star. He was inducted into the United States Army Ranger Hall of Fame in 1993. He died in 2014 at the age of 100. For decades, he could not tell anyone what he had done. The entire military intelligence service program was classified. The men who had arguably done more to win the intelligence war in the Pacific than any other single unit were ordered to say nothing about their service, and most of them obeyed that order for the rest of their lives. On another island, in another battle, another Nisei linguist was doing something equally impossible by Japanese expectations. His name was Bob Hoichi Kubo. On Saipan, in the summer of 1944, Kubo was attached to the 27th Infantry Division. He learned that Japanese soldiers were holding more than 120 civilians hostage in a cliffside cave, using them as human shields. Kubo crawled into the cave alone. He was unarmed. He faced 8 armed Japanese soldiers in the dark. He shared his K-rations with the civilians. He talked for hours. He talked in a Japanese that was not the textbook Japanese of a foreign student, but the Japanese of a man whose parents had come from the same country as the men holding the rifles. He persuaded the soldiers to surrender. 122 civilians walked out of that cave alive. Kubo received the Distinguished Service Cross. There are dozens of these stories scattered across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. On Okinawa, Nisei linguists who spoke the local dialect, men like Takejiro Higa, who had grown up on the island and recognized former classmates among the prisoners he interrogated, talked soldiers and civilians out of caves where they had been told the Americans would torture and kill them. One Nisei linguist persuaded 350 Japanese officers and men to surrender in a single engagement. Another cleared 11 of 12 caves assigned to him without a shot being fired. A medic named Herbert Yanamura used a loudspeaker to coax approximately 1,500 civilians out of hiding. The pattern kept repeating in different settings. Later, in December of 1944, a Nisei linguist named Frank Hachia interrogated a captured Japanese soldier, and extracted intelligence about an impending counterattack. Minutes later, Hachiya was mortally wounded. He crawled back to his unit and delivered the intelligence before he died. He did not have to deliver it. He could have lain still and waited for a medic. But the information mattered, and Frank Hachiya decided he was the one who had to make sure it got through. If the Nisei linguists were the system the Japanese never imagined, the third system, running simultaneously across the same battlefields, was something even more improbable. It was a weapon built from a language that had no written form, spoken by fewer than 50,000 people on Earth, and rooted in a culture that the United States government had spent generations trying to destroy. In early 1942, a man named Philip Johnston walked into the headquarters of the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific and made a proposal that sounded, to the officers who heard it, almost absurd. Johnston was a civil engineer. He was nearly 50 years old. He was the son of a Protestant missionary named William Johnston, who had raised his family on the Navajo reservation near Loop, Arizona. Philip Johnston had grown up among the Navajo. He was one of perhaps 30 non-Navajo people on Earth who understood the language. He knew something about it that the Marine Corps did not. Navajo, known to its speakers as Diné Bizard, is a southern Athabascan language. It bears no structural resemblance to any European or Asian language. It is tonal, meaning that the pitch at which a syllable is spoken changes its meaning entirely. It is verb-centered, with a system of stacked prefixes that can encode an extraordinary amount of information into a single word. At the time, it had no widely used written form. And critically, outside of the Navajo people themselves, and a handful of missionaries and anthropologists, virtually no one on Earth could speak it or understand it. No Japanese linguist had ever studied it. No Japanese dictionary of it existed. No Japanese intelligence officer had ever heard it. Johnston proposed using Navajo speakers to transmit tactical messages by voice over open radio channels. The messages would be in the clear, meaning they would not be mechanically encrypted, but the language itself would be the encryption. To anyone listening who was not a Navajo speaker, the transmissions would be meaningless, an unidentifiable stream of sounds with no written form to analyze, no cognates to guess at, no structural similarity to any language the enemy had ever encountered. Johnston arranged a demonstration at Camp Elliott for Major General Clayton Vogel. He showed that a team of Navajo speakers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line tactical message in 20 seconds. The same message, sent through the standard military encryption machines of the time, took 30 minutes. Vogel recommended the immediate recruitment of 200 Navajo speakers. The Marine Corps authorized an initial pilot of 30. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo men boarded a bus at Fort Defiance, Arizona. They became the first 29. Most of them were young. Several were teenagers. Almost all of them had attended federal boarding schools, where the explicit policy of the United States government had been to eradicate their language and their culture. They had been punished for speaking Navajo. They had been told that their language was primitive, that it had no place in the modern world, that the path to American citizenship ran through English and only English. Now, the United States Marine Corps was telling them that the language they had been beaten for speaking was going to win a war. Chester Nez, who would become the last surviving member of the original 29, remembered this contradiction for the rest of his life. He had attended boarding school in Tuba City, Arizona, where speaking Navajo was forbidden. Teachers washed students' mouths with soap for using their own language. Decades later, Nez would say that the irony was not lost on him, that the same government that had tried to destroy his language was now asking him to use it as a weapon. He said yes anyway. They all did. They completed boot camp as the All-Navajo Platoon, 382, graduating June 27, 1942. At Camp Pendleton, they were given a task no military unit had ever been asked to perform. They were told to build, from scratch, a code within their own language. They created a system with a phonetic alphabet and a vocabulary of military terms, initially around 211 words, eventually expanding to more than 400. Every term was a Navajo word, substituted for an English military concept. A submarine was an iron fish. A bomber was a buzzard. A tank was a turtle. A commanding general was a war chief. The words were chosen with care. They had to be memorable. They had to be unambiguous when spoken rapidly under fire. And the entire code was memorized. Nothing was ever written down in the field. A code talker carried the code in his head, or he did not carry it at all. The code worked because it operated on two levels of impenetrability. The first level was the Navajo language itself, which no Japanese cryptanalyst could identify, let alone analyze. The second level was the substitution code layered on top of it. Even a Navajo speaker, who was not a trained code talker, could not decipher a message because the substituted terms had no logical relationship to their meanings in standard Navajo. The Japanese learned this the hard way, though they did not understand what they had learned. A Navajo soldier named Joe Kiaumiah had been captured at Bataan in 1942. He was a prisoner of war for more than 3 years. When the Japanese intercepted code talker transmissions and realized they were hearing an unidentified language, they brought Kiaumiah in and forced him to listen. He could hear that the language was Navajo. He was a native speaker, but the words made no sense. Iron fish, buzzard, turtle, war chief. The code talkers had built a cipher within a language within a culture, and even a man born into that culture could not crack it without the key that existed only in the memories of the code talkers themselves. The code talkers served in all 6 Marine divisions. They participated in every major marine assault in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal through Okinawa. They faced a danger that no other American servicemen faced. Because they were Navajo, their features sometimes resembled those of Japanese soldiers closely enough that they were occasionally detained or threatened by their own comrades who mistook them for infiltrators. Some code talkers were assigned fellow Marines to escort them specifically to prevent these incidents. They served under conditions of double jeopardy, at risk from the enemy and at risk from the confusion of their own side. At Iwo Jima, in February of 1945, 6 Navajo code talkers assigned to the 5th Marine Division worked around the clock for the first 48 hours of the battle. They sent and received more than 800 messages without a single error. In a battle where Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying the island with tunnels, bunkers, and concealed firing positions, where every yard of advance was bought in blood, the speed and security of the code talker communications gave Marine commanders a critical edge. Orders could be transmitted in seconds rather than the minutes or hours required by machine encryption. Adjustments to fire support, repositioning of units, and coordination between assault teams happened in real time. Major Howard Connor, the division's signal officer, said afterward that the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without the Navajo code talkers. The code was never broken, not during the war, not after the war. It remains one of the very few military codes in modern history that was never deciphered by an enemy. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, who headed Japanese Army intelligence, reportedly acknowledged after the war that his analysts had been able to break American Army and Army Air Force codes, but had never been able to decipher the code used by the Marines. He did not know what language it was. He did not know where it came from. He did not know that the answer was a people whose children had been punished in American government-run boarding schools for speaking the very language that was now winning America's war. And this is where the 3 threads converge, into the thing that Japanese officers, during the war and after it, could never quite articulate. The United States did not defeat Japan's communications security through any single technical breakthrough. It defeated it through something that looked, from the Japanese side, like an impossibility. The Americans had somehow produced a military that could read Japanese as fluently as a Japanese officer. That could speak a language no cryptanalyst on Earth could identify. That could break a mathematical cipher the Imperial Navy's best minds had certified as unbreakable. And all 3 of these capabilities came from the same source, a source that Japanese strategic thinking had no category for. They came from the diversity of the American population itself. Japan in the 1930s and 1940s was one of the most linguistically and ethnically homogeneous major nations on Earth. Its military planning assumptions reflected that homogeneity, its intelligence assessments reflected it, its code design reflected it. When Japanese code designers assessed the risk that an enemy might be able to read Japanese, they were thinking of white Americans and white Europeans. They were thinking of men who would have to learn Japanese as a foreign language, a process that takes years even for gifted students, and which, in the specific domain of military Japanese with its classical constructions and specialized kanji compounds, was considered by Japanese language experts to be functionally impossible for an adult foreign learner to achieve at the speed required for real-time battlefield intelligence. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the American government's own assessment suggested that only a handful of non-Japanese Americans had full professional command of the language. 3. By one widely cited count from the Office of War Information, 3 people in a country of 130 million. But the Japanese analysts were asking the wrong question. The question was not how many white Americans could read Japanese. The question was how many Americans could read Japanese. And the answer to that question was thousands. They were living in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Honolulu and Seattle. They were the sons and daughters of immigrants from Hiroshima and Kumamoto and Okinawa. Many of them were Kibei, Nisei, who had been sent back to Japan for part of their education and who could read military Japanese as easily as they could read the Los Angeles Times. They were American citizens. And the Japanese military establishment, despite knowing intellectually that Japanese Americans existed, never incorporated that knowledge into its security planning, because the idea that a person could be simultaneously Japanese and American, that identity could be divided, that loyalty could run against the grain of ancestry, simply did not fit inside the conceptual framework of 1940s Japan. When Japanese intelligence officers assessed the risk that an unbreakable voice code might exist, they were scanning the known universe of European languages, looking for something obscure enough to resist analysis. They were not thinking of an indigenous American language spoken by a small nation within a nation on a high desert reservation in Arizona. They were not thinking of a language with no written form, no dictionaries accessible to outsiders, and no structural relationship to anything in Europe or Asia. They were not thinking of Chester Nez. When the Navy's cipher designers assessed the security of JN-25, they built their confidence on the assumption that the mathematical super-encipherment was strong enough to resist brute force cryptanalysis, and that even if fragments were broken, the underlying Japanese text would be impenetrable to foreign analysts. They were not thinking of Joseph Rochefort, who had lived in Japan for 3 years and dreamed in Japanese, or of the team of Nisei translators, who could read a partially decrypted intercept and fill in the gaps from context, because the language was their own. The Japanese assumption was that their language was a wall. The American answer was that walls work only against people who have never been inside them. But this raises the question the story has been building toward. If the Japanese codes were being broken, if their orders were being read, if their most secret operational plans were being intercepted and translated, why did they not know? Why did they not change their codes? Why did they not take the elementary precautions that any competent signals intelligence organization would take once compromise was suspected? The answer is that they did suspect, and they investigated, and they got the answer wrong, every single time. After Yamamoto's death in April of 1943, the Naval General Staff conducted a thorough review. They examined the JN-25 cipher. They tested it. They concluded it was secure. They attributed the ambush to a breach in a low-grade Army communications code, a conclusion that was driven in part by genuine analytical error and in part by inter-service rivalry so intense that the Navy would rather blame the Army for a security failure than admit that its own crown jewel cipher had been cracked. The rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy was one of the defining structural weaknesses of the Japanese war effort. The two services operated separate intelligence agencies, separate code systems, and separate chains of command that shared information reluctantly and sometimes not at all. When the Navy investigated the Yamamoto shoot-down, the Army was a convenient scapegoat, and the alternative, that JN-25 was compromised, was an admission that would have required the Navy to redesign its entire communications architecture. The Navy chose the easier answer. The Navy continued using JN-25. The Americans continued reading it. After the Battle of Midway, where the connection between intelligence and outcome was blindingly obvious, there was no Japanese reassessment. The assumption held. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japan lost hundreds of aircraft in 2 days because the American fleet knew precisely what was coming, there was no reassessment. And the reason there was no reassessment at the Philippine Sea was perhaps the cruelest detail in the entire story. On March 31, 1944, Admiral Minachi Koga, who had replaced Yamamoto as Combined Fleet Commander, was killed when his aircraft went down in a storm near the Philippines. In the wreckage of the second aircraft, which crash-landed off the island of Cebu, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Koga's chief of staff, survived and was briefly captured by Filipino guerrillas. A waterproof case recovered from the crash contained the Z Plan, Combined Fleet Secret Operations Order, No. 73. This was Japan's master blueprint for the decisive naval battle they believed would turn the war. It detailed fleet dispositions, carrier assignments, air attack patterns, and the intended sequence of engagement. The documents were smuggled out by submarine. The USS Creval, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Francis Walker, carried the Z Plan along with 40 civilian evacuees to Darwin, Australia. From there, the documents reached the Allied Translator and Interpreter section in Brisbane. A team of 5 Nisei translators, including Yoshikazu Yamada and George Yamashiro, worked through the entire plan. It was hundreds of pages of dense operational Japanese, the kind of military writing that the Imperial Navy had been confident no American could read. The translation was completed and distributed by May 23, 1944. Admiral Nimitz had it on his desk. The Z Plan laid out everything: the disposition of the combined fleet, the assignment of carrier air groups, the coordination between land-based and carrier-based aircraft, the intended sequence in which Japanese forces would engage an American advance in the Western Pacific. It was the blueprint for what the Japanese called the decisive battle, the engagement they believed would turn the tide of the war in a single stroke. When Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sortied with the Japanese mobile fleet in June of 1944 to execute what was essentially the Z Plan under a new name, Admiral Raymond Spruance was waiting for him with exact knowledge of the Japanese order of battle, the axis of approach, and the tactical doctrine the Japanese pilots had been trained to execute. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan lost close to 500 aircraft over 2 days, including roughly 350 carrier planes shot down on June 19th alone. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's carrier aviation, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific in the first months of the war, ceased to exist as a fighting force in 48 hours. The Nisei translators who made it possible were names that would not appear in any history book for another 30 years. After the war ended, American interrogators sat across from Japanese officers and, for the first time, told some of them the truth. The reactions, recorded in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey interrogations and in scattered post-war interviews, range from disbelief to something that reads, on the page, very much like grief. Officers who had spent the war trusting in the impregnability of their communications were told that the Americans had been reading their orders for years. Some refused to believe it. Some asked how. Some fell silent. Some demanded to know which specific messages had been read, as if narrowing the scope might reduce the shame. The consistent thread in the reactions was not anger but bewilderment. The question was always the same: how could Americans read Japanese? Officers who had commanded divisions and fleets were told that their operational plans had been known to the enemy before their own subordinates received them. They were told that the Americans had not needed spies. They had not needed traitors. They had simply listened to the radio traffic that the Japanese themselves were broadcasting and read it. the assumption that had underwritten their entire communications architecture, the assumption that the Japanese language was itself a form of security, had been wrong from the beginning. The answer, which none of them found satisfying, was that the Americans in question were also Japanese. They were men with Japanese faces and Japanese names, who had been born in California and Oregon and Hawaii, who had been raised between two cultures, who had been imprisoned by one of those cultures and then asked to fight for it, and who had said yes. That was the part the Japanese officers could not process. Not the mathematics of the code breaking, not the mechanics of the cipher machines, but the human fact that the United States contained within its own population a generation of young men who were culturally Japanese and politically American, and who had chosen, despite everything their country had done to them, to use their inheritance as a weapon on behalf of the country that had wronged them. Major General Charles Willoughby, General Douglas MacArthur's chief of intelligence, made an assessment after the war that has been quoted in every official account since. He said that the Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved possibly 1 million American lives. President Harry Truman called the Nisei of the Military Intelligence Service the human secret weapon of the United States Armed Forces. These are large claims. They are also, by the judgment of the historians who have studied the intelligence war in the Pacific most carefully, defensible. The verdict on what the Japanese officers could not explain is not complicated. It is simply uncomfortable. Japan built its communications security on 2 assumptions. The first assumption was mathematical. Their codes were strong. The second assumption was cultural. Their language was impenetrable. The mathematical assumption was wrong because the Americans had brilliant cryptanalysts like William Friedman, who broke purple at the cost of a nervous breakdown, and Joseph Rochefort, who broke enough of JN-25 in a basement to win the Battle of Midway. But the cultural assumption was the deeper error. It was the error that made all the other errors possible. Because the Japanese believed their language was a wall, they did not fortify it. Because they did not fortify it, the Nisei walked through it. Because they believed no code could replicate the impenetrability of Japanese, they never imagined that another language, spoken by a people they had never heard of, on a continent they had never visited, could be even more impenetrable than their own. Japan assumed that language was a barrier defined by nationality. The Americans proved that language is a bridge defined by people, and the people who built that bridge were the ones Japan never saw coming. Here is what happened to the men who made this possible, and why most of the world never heard their names. The Navajo Code Talker program was classified until 1968. For 23 years after the war ended, the men who had transmitted the messages that helped take Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Saipan could not tell their families what they had done. Chester Nez, the last surviving member of the original 29, lived until 2014. He spent decades unable to speak about the most important thing he had ever done. When the Congressional Gold Medal was finally awarded to the original 29 in 2001, presented by President George W. Bush, all but 5 of the recipients had already died. Only 4 were strong enough to attend the ceremony. They had waited 56 years. The Military Intelligence Service was classified even longer. The Nisei linguists who had translated the Z Plan, who had interrogated thousands of prisoners, who had crawled behind enemy lines to tap telephone wires and shouted false commands in Japanese to lure soldiers into ambushes, were told when they came home to say nothing. Many of them continued to serve during the occupation of Japan, where their language skills made them indispensable as interpreters, administrators, and liaisons between the American military government and the Japanese population. They helped translate and administer the sweeping reforms that reshaped Japanese society. They helped rebuild the country whose military they had helped defeat. And through all of it, they could not speak about the war they had actually fought. Most of them obeyed. They went back to California and Oregon and Hawaii. They went back to communities that had been scattered by internment. They took quiet jobs. They did not march in parades. The Presidential Unit Citation for the Military Intelligence Service did not come until the year 2000. The Congressional Gold Medal, awarded collectively with the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was signed into law by President Barack Obama on October 5, 2010, and presented on November 2, 2011. The insignia on the medal is a sphinx, the ancient symbol of secrecy. Many of the men it honored were gone. Roy Matsumoto, the man who stood up on a hill in Burma and shouted a Japanese command that sent dozens of enemy soldiers to their deaths, came home and could not tell the story for decades. John Iso, the brown valedictorian who built the language school's curriculum in an airplane hangar, went on to a distinguished legal career and received the Legion of Merit in 1965 and the Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese government in 1984. He died in 1987. Bob Kubo, who walked into a cave alone and talked 8 armed men into surrendering, returned to a country that had imprisoned his family. Frank Hachia, who crawled back with intelligence after being mortally wounded on later, did not return at all. Joseph Rochefort, the codebreaker who won Midway in his bathrobe and slippers, was denied the Distinguished Service Medal he was recommended for because of a bureaucratic feud with the Navy's Washington headquarters. The medal was finally awarded posthumously in 1986, 10 years after his death. The Navy had spent 4 decades arguing about whether to give a medal to the man who had saved it. The Japanese officers who sat through the post-war interrogations and learned, for the first time, that their most secret communications had been transparent to the enemy were grappling with something more than a tactical revelation. They were grappling with a failure of imagination. They had imagined an enemy that looked like them, homogeneous, monocultural, a nation in which language and nationality were the same thing. They had fought instead a nation in which a Navajo sheep herder from Arizona and a Nisei truck driver from Los Angeles and a Danish-born army officer from the Midwest and a cryptanalyst from Indiana who had been hospitalized by the Alpha strain of his own brilliance were all part of the same war effort, and all of them, each in their own way, had been turned into instruments for reading Japan's mind. Nobody designed this as a system. That is the part that matters most. There was no American strategic planner who sat down in 1941 and said, "We will use the diversity of our population as an intelligence weapon." There was no master plan that coordinated the codebreakers in Washington with the linguists in Minnesota, with the code talkers in Arizona. The Nisei program began because a few officers realized they had Japanese-speaking citizens and needed Japanese-speaking soldiers. The Navajo program began because a missionary's son had an idea and a Marine general was willing to listen. The code-breaking program began because a small group of mathematicians refused to believe that any cipher was unbreakable. These were separate decisions made by separate people in separate buildings, who did not coordinate with each other, and in some cases did not know the others existed. What connected them was not a plan. It was a country messy enough and contradictory enough and plural enough to contain, within itself, the tools to read its enemy's most guarded secrets. A country that imprisoned Japanese Americans and recruited them in the same year. A country that punished Navajo children for speaking their language and then begged Navajo men to speak it into radios. A country that underfunded its code-breaking agencies and then relied on their breakthroughs to win its most important battles. The contradictions were real. The results were also real. And the results happened not because the contradictions were resolved, but because the country was large enough and chaotic enough to contain them all at once. Japan's greatest vulnerability was its certainty that it had none. And the men who proved it, the code talkers and the code breakers, and the Nisei linguists who served a country that was simultaneously imprisoning their parents, were never the men the history books remembered first. They were quiet men who came home to quiet lives and kept quiet about the most extraordinary thing they had ever done, not because they chose silence, but because their country ordered it. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this story reach the people who care about getting the history right. Not the history that simplifies and not the history that flatters, but the history that actually happened, with the names and the contradictions and the uncomfortable truths intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary people who were asked to do extraordinary things by a country that did not always treat them as though they belonged to it, and who did those things anyway, and who deserve to be remembered, not for the medals they eventually received, but for the years of silence they carried without complaint. They had names. They came from somewhere. They changed the war, and they deserve to be remembered.